You know, when you think of an intelligence test, it sounds so official, so scientific. But the story of how he got it? It's not really a story about lab coats and theories. It was born in the real world to solve a very real problem, and it all kicked off with a pretty huge question.
I mean, really think about that. How do you actually measure something you can't see or touch? That was the big hurdle for early psychologists. They wanted to understand this thing called intelligence, but to do that, they needed some kind of tool. And the invention of that tool, well, it didn't start in a lab, it started in a classroom.
Okay, so let's jump back in time to 1905. The French government had just made this amazing decision. Every child gets to go to school. Awesome, right? But it created a brand new problem. Teachers needed a way to figure out which kids were falling behind and needed extra help, and they needed a way to do it that was fair and objective.
And this is where our first key player, psychologist Alfred Binet, steps onto the scene. He and his partner Theodore Simon came up with something called the Binet-Simon scale. Now, its purpose was revolutionary. It wasn't about sticking a label on kids. It was about helping them. It was a diagnostic tool. But the real genius, the part that changed everything, wasn't in the questions he asked. It was in what he did with the answers.
This right here was Binet's truly world-changing idea, the standardization sample. See, before him, if you got a score on a test, it was just a number. It didn't mean anything by itself. Binet's big insight was to ask, well, what if we compare that number to a group? He tested a bunch of kids under the exact same conditions to create a norm or a baseline. And just like that, a score wasn't just a number anymore. It had context. You could finally see if a child was average, above average, or needed a little more support.
And get this whole massive concept that would create an entire field of psychology, it started with just 50 kids. That's it. From this tiny group, the entire world of psychological testing began to grow. But believe me, the evolution was just getting started.
Binet wasn't one to rest on his laurels. Just 3 years later, by 1908, he was already making his test better. The new version had way more questions and a bigger sample group. But it also introduced an idea so powerful it would basically define intelligence testing for the next 50 years: mental age.
So, what exactly is mental age? It's a beautifully simple concept. It doesn't care about how many birthdays you've had. That's your chronological age. Instead, it asks, at what age level are you performing? So, if you do as well on the test as the average 10-year-old, your mental age is 10. Doesn't matter if you're actually 7 or 15.
This gave teachers an incredibly powerful new perspective. Let's say you have a student who's 12 years old, but on the test, their score matches the average 8-year-old. All of a sudden, teachers have critical information. It's not just, this kid is struggling. It tells them at what level they need to provide help. It was a game-changing diagnostic idea.
Now, an idea this powerful wasn't going to stay in France for long. It spread like wildfire, and it really took root over in the United States. A psychologist over at Stanford University, a guy named L.M. Terman, saw the huge potential here and decided to create an American version.
Terman's 1916 update, which became the super famous Stanford Binet test, was a huge leap. Look at this. He exploded the standardization sample to 1,000 people. That's a massive jump from Binet's original 50. This push for bigger, more representative samples gave the whole testing movement a new kind of scientific credibility. It was becoming a very serious business.
But this serious scientific tool had one major bottleneck. The Stanford Binet had to be done one-on-one with a trained professional. It was thorough, sure, but it was slow. And the world was about to face a problem that needed a solution that was anything but slow.
Yup, World War I. The United States enters the war, and suddenly the military has this giant logistical nightmare on its hands. How do you evaluate thousands and thousands of new recruits, and fast? They needed to figure out who was suited for which jobs, and they needed to know, like, yesterday. A one-on-one test just wasn't going to cut it.
So, the Army turned to psychologists, led by a man named Robert Yerkes, and their solution was another landmark moment, the group test. They actually developed 2 of them. The Army Alpha was for recruits who could read and write, but, and this is so important, they also created the Army Beta. This was a test for recruits who are illiterate, using pictures and symbols instead of words. For the very first time, intelligence was being tested on a massive scale.
The war was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Once people saw how efficient group testing could be, its use just exploded into everyday life. Suddenly, schools, colleges, even big industries were using these tests to sort people, to select people, to solve problems.
The testing movement was no longer just some tool for academics, it was becoming a part of the fabric of society.
But you know how it goes. When something gets that popular, it also gets put under a microscope. People started to ask some tough questions. Is intelligence really just one single number? And are these tests actually fair to everybody?
And here was the heart of the criticism. The big tests, like the Stanford Binet, were super heavy on language and verbal skills. That meant they weren't really appropriate for anyone who couldn't read well, or didn't speak the language, or had some kind of verbal disability. Plus, a lot of experts were starting to argue that intelligence is way more than just being good with words. The tests were just too narrow.
So as these criticisms got louder, the stage was set for another innovator. In 1939, a psychologist named David Wechsler published a brand new test that was designed to fix the very weaknesses people were pointing out in the Stanford Binet. He was about to set a whole new standard.
Wechsler's approach was brilliant. First, his test didn't just spit out one single IQ score. It gave you a whole profile, a pattern of different abilities. Second, and this was huge, it included a full performance scale. These were nonverbal tests that could measure intelligence without language. This totally opened up testing to more people and gave a much richer, more complete picture of a person's cognitive strengths.
When you look back at the whole story, you can see this clear line of progress. Just look at the numbers. We go from Binet's original group of 50 kids to a sample of over 3,000 just a few decades later. There was this constant push to make the tests better, more accurate, and more representative, with each new version responding to the needs and the criticisms of the time.
So what are the big takeaways here? First, remember that these tests weren't just some abstract idea. They were practical tools built to solve real-world problems. Second, their entire history is about evolution and refinement, always pushing for better standardization to make the scores actually mean something. And finally, our very idea of what intelligence is has broadened, moving away from just a single verbal score to a much more complex pattern of abilities.
This story is definitely not over. From a single classroom in France to being used all over the globe, the intelligence test has been in a constant state of change. Which, of course, leaves us with one last big question to think about. After over 100 years of evolution, what's next? What's the next big idea in our ongoing quest to understand intelligence?